Hey everybody, what's up? OCD Mikey for another edition of the Mikey Show, and ripping it to you live in the morning. Well, it's almost afternoon on Saturday, and going over a quick topic that comes up a lot. And basically, these morning riffs are going to be these quick riffs are going to be just sort of addressing things that maybe people talk about a lot and just getting it down to the nitty gritty. Again, my purpose here is to clear through the crud for you guys of hi-fi and just get straight and to the point with many ideas and concepts to help you navigate this. Took me 23 years of doing this as a career to find my way through this, and now I'm sharing my knowledge with you so you can cut through the BS. So tubes are solid state. What is the deal? What is the difference? What is the whole breakdown? Here's how I see it, okay? And this might be easy for you to remember. Think of tubes and solid state, T and S, right? Tube or SS, whatever. Tubes are for tweaking, okay? So we'll use a T. Tubes are for tweaking. Solid state is for serenity, okay? What I mean by that, and I don't mean one is better than the others, okay? I have both tube amps and I have solid state amps. I use them for different purposes and for different reasons. A tube and a tube amplifier, and especially the old single-ended triodes and things like that, they're very much, it's a tweaky thing. What do I mean when I say tweaky? I mean that you're constantly in your mind, okay? Your mind is constantly aware of oversight of your tube gear. Because if something sounds weird in a tube system, the first thing you're going after is a bad tube or a weird tube, okay? You must realize tubes have a huge envelope or a huge scope of operational characteristics. They have different spec when they're cold, when you just start them up, than they do an hour later when they've gotten into their operational envelope. Some amps with big transformers and so forth can take longer to warm them up. But during that time, and this is actually true for both, with transistors, not so much, but even a solid state amp needs to warm up. Tubes, however, will, as depending on the temperature, they will drift, okay? Over time, tubes will drift. No two tubes is made exactly perfectly the same. A lot of times, some of the NOS stuff was done, they're done with old machines. The specification, the tolerances weren't as tight as maybe the tubes are today. Of course, they sounded better back then. Go figure in many times, in many ways. So a tube in an amplifier, for instance, or a preamp, you're going to have a left side tube and a right side tube if it's isolated, if you have a right and left, if it's dual mono. Sometimes you have a dual triode where you have a single tube that shares left half and a right half for the left channel and the right channel. Now that means in a single tube, let's say we'll take in the dual triode, for instance, you have to have those two halves of that tube. See if I have one. I've got a light bulb. I don't have a vacuum tube. They're up tucked away. Anyways, so half that tube, that half of the tube specification needs to perfectly match the other half of the tube specification, which is very unlikely. Okay, this is why you have gold grade tubes, silver grade, bronze grade, and poop grade that you just chuck. There's different levels. They rate them. The mil spec tubes are gold grade, however you want to call it, are military specification. Those dual triodes are so well matched on both sides, but they're not perfect, but they can get close, really close. That is a premium tube, okay? And in the case of two separate tubes, which sometimes can be even more audiophile because you're separating the left and the right into separate tubes, your left tube has to perfectly match your right tube. So that means you really want to get a pair of tubes that were in the same production run, that came out of the same factory on the same production run, like, number 20,035, number 20,036 would be ideal, right? But these tubes are not serialized. Maybe in some cases they are, but most of the time they're not. You can only refer to little markings on the ink to see what tube factory that came out and maybe what year it came out. You can give or take. So you have to put them in a tube matcher to try and match these two tubes. Now, most tube testers are old. They're not new. They're not tight spec. There is one that's new that people, and I'm dropping the name of it right now. It has a little printout, and it's a modern tube tester, but even that one is not perfect. We need to hand enter in the parameters of the tube so that when you punch that tube in, it uses the parameters that we put in and we give it. And it's not always perfect. So it's an imperfect science to match tubes. You can get them close, but it truly is an imperfect science. And we're comparing our left side to our right side. So we have to get the measurement right for left and right. Now, are we sitting there as end users with scopes and different measurement equipment? Are we sitting? I will take that banner off there so you guys don't have to sit and see it all the time. You get the idea. Please sign up. Anyways, or subscribe. It helps the channel. Thumbs up if you like videos like this one so I know which videos to make more of. Anyways, so are we sitting there with oscilloscopes, with different measurement gear in our homes once we put the tubes in to make sure that everything in that circuit is the same? Because we might get matched tubes, but are those transformers matched? Are all the resistors and all the other things matched? Okay. And especially when you take out the tubes, when they have it in the factory, they may have the factory tubes that are in there. They measure everything. They get it all dialed in. Now they send it to you 10 years later or whatever, years later, you switch the tubes out. You just change the parameters. So now a different measuring tube may have made up for non-measured capacitors. If you're catching my drift, tubes are not a perfect science. Okay. So there's always that in the back of your mind. If something isn't imaging right, is one side a little bit more gain, a little bit more noise than the other side? So these are the things that go on in a person who is OCD. I'm not really OCD. I'm just super particular. So these are the things that go on in my mind. What is off with the tubes? And then, God forbid, when do they need to be changed? Unless you have a tube tester at home and you're testing each time, you have to make a guess. Rarely do the tubes explode or just go out. They just get weaker, 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 weaker. And then, so many times you're listening to an amp that's weak because you haven't changed a tube. You're like, oh, it works perfectly. But really, it's weak. So it's not giving you the dynamics or anything like that. And you don't know how many people I talk to. They're like, I'm thinking of getting a new amp. They have a tube amp or something. I say, well, how old are the tubes? Well, they're 12 years old. They're the original tubes. I'm like, well, start with the freaking tubes before I sell you a new amplifier. Retube it and make sure that you didn't just lose the dynamics because the tubes are old. So these are the things that go on in your mind as when you're listening to tube amps. Now, tubes do something special. They have a certain distortion, a second order harmonic distortion, amongst other things that give you this ethereal, floaty kind of a sound. It's a distortion that is not present as much present anyways in a solid state amp. So tubes have something that solid state doesn't have. And a lot of times it has to do with that second order harmonic. It has to do with this ethereal, floaty, dreamy kind of thing. Okay, so on one hand, you get the dreamy thing. On the other hand, you get the anxiety or the mental oversight that you must keep to have your tubes perfectly aligned, side to side, in perfect specification, all that kind of stuff. Now, if you don't give a crap and you just want tubes and throw them in and it's all good and you don't get anxiety over that, then cool, all the power to you. Tubes will burn more energy. They'll be hot. You can't usually have them around kids or pets. Unless you have a tube cage. So, and you have to have them ventilated, all this kind of stuff, right? So there's a lot more that goes on, a lot of more baggage, if you will, that goes along with the tube. Now, if you're okay carrying that baggage, that's fine. Solid state is for serenity, okay? Solid state, the reason I say serenity is because you don't have to think about any of that, okay? And especially in a good, well-built design, something like, say, Jeff Roland, I mean, these are finely tuned for each side to match. They're measured, and he gets everything dialed perfect. Now, that is not going to drift out of operational spec. Of course, between cold and warm, it'll have a slight, very slight bit of drift. But once it's in its operational temperature, and Roland's and solid state amps are built, you can leave them on 100% of the time. You should never leave your tube amplifier on all the time. You can, however, do that with the solid state. So solid states, you can flip them on and then either keep them in standby or keep them on. And you can, they're in their operational temperature all the time. Every time you go in, you don't have to wait for warm up because it's been on. Okay, I know Roland amps are designed that way, and I'm not sure there will be a handful of solid state amplifiers that you can leave them on 24/7. You're not going to damage anything. They can be on for 20 years solid, never turned off, and they're fine. Okay, that's how these things are built. So solid state to me is less things to think about. I have enough things to think about in my audio room with the music, with everything, that I don't want another thing to think about, such as tubes, even though tubes are fun. It's like riding an old chopper. It's fun to ride around, but do you really want to take it on a trip? Do you want to use that old 1967 panhead? Do you want to use that every, I know maybe panheads are earlier, maybe 67 is a shovel art. Now, what's before a shovel? And knuckle was the first one. Whatever, you get my drift, right? An old ass chopper bike, right? They're cool, man. You pull up to the place, you're cool. Just like telling people you've got single-ended triode amps. It's cool to slide into the coffee shop with your chopper, or to slide into the forums with your tube amps. That's cool, right? But in reality, over time, can you take it on a trip? Do you use it every day? Some people, there are certain amps. Manly's one of them. You can use Manly amps every day. They're pro level stuff. There's probably not going to be much problems with tweakability with Manly amps, especially the ones that are not single-ended triode, that have many pentodes and they have a bunch of tubes. You can count on, if one goes out of whack, the other ones will kind of balance out for it. So you don't have to be so concerned about them being perfectly matched as you do when you have a single-ended tube, a single tube on each side. So solid state is serenity, man. You put that thing in, you don't have to think about the amp. You shouldn't have to if it's well built. And it removes the anxiety. I'm not making a case for either or. Okay, I still use tube amps. Now, another thing about tube amps, you're going to want a stash of tubes, because your tubes may go out, or things you may want to change. The cool thing about tubes is you can greatly change the sound of your amplifier. You can carve and tune and paint your masterpiece using different tubes. A Mullard ECC 88 or 83, whatever, is going to sound different than a Bugle Boy, an Amperex. That's going to sound different than a German Telefunken, so everyone, that's going to sound different than a Japanese Mitsubishi. They all have their own different sound. So if I love to taste coffee, taste fine wines. So that part of me, the tasting part of me, that little squirrel is fed. My tasting squirrel gets fed by vacuum tubes, because I can try different flavors of tubes. So that's fun too, if I have the time to do tasting when I want to listen to music. Okay. Some people just want the meal. They don't want to get caught up in the whole tasting of it, never really getting, well, they eventually get full, but you've lost all, discernment between flavors at some point. Okay. So I know this has been a stream of consciousness. I'm pouring it out to try and get the point across, but I think you guys can get the point across. Tubes are for tweaking. Solid state is for serenity. That's the easiest way for me to put it into a nutshell for you guys. Tubes can be very fun. Okay. Tasting things and being a connoisseur and trying all different flavors is a fun pastime when you decide to do that and you want to do that. And these are not absolutes. Not every tube amp is going to be like that. Single-ended triodes are going to be more tweaky than the pentode push-pull, those type of amps. But generally speaking, tubes have to be changed. You have to have backups. You want to have a stash. I've got a freaking closet full. I don't even use them. I stick to my solid state stuff. What would be a dream is if you had, solid state things that can do the ethereal nature of tubes, and never have to be, and not have a tube. There are a couple brands. Jeff Rowland is one of them. Viola Labs is another one. Many people consider these amps kind of sound tube-like. It doesn't mean they're wallowy. The other drawback to a vacuum tube is it doesn't have control of the speaker as much as a solid state does. Solid state has a stiff power supply and a real good grip of the speaker. It controls it well. That means it starts it and it stops it. It's really controls it well. A tube is loose. And that is good for some things and not good for others. And so these are just some of the differences between solid state and tube. One's going to control the speaker tighter, better. So speakers that are less sensitive are going to be better with solid state amps. You start to get into a speaker that doesn't take much to be controlled, like anything over 93 dB sensitivity, that can be controlled very easily. So you don't need all that brawn and heft of a solid state, because you can control that speaker with a vacuum tube. So you have nuance, okay? So there's different things, but just keep in mind, generally speaking, one is less trouble than the other. One gives more joy of tasting than the other. One is more business. I say a lot of times, you'll hear me say, tubes are for play, solid state is for business, okay? And so if your business is listening to music, make your choice just based on what I've told you. I've given you a lot of information. I'm running past my time, so I'm going. See you.